Okay, well, hello everybody. Thanks for joining today. This will be a webinar on advanced usage of TMS. For those of you who are alt-tabbed, I'll give you a couple seconds to get ready, and then we'll go ahead and get started on this. Okay, so this first tag is just kind of an introduction, or this first slide is just kind of an introduction slide about us and, ultimately about what's bringing you this content today. And it's thanks to Tag Inspector, which is we at InfoTrust have created this product. Tag Inspector essentially helps automate scanning of tags and data validation and whatnot. I assume some of you are familiar with this. Also a little bit about InfoTrust. We're a web analytics company. We work in tag management, and then ultimately we have a couple of products that have come out of problems and that are basically solutions for things that have come in that sphere of web analytics and tag management. Currently, we analyze and support over 2,000 sites worldwide. We put on over 30 digital marketing and training programs a year, and we are located in Cincinnati with also a remote office in Dubai. My name is Tyler Blatt. I will be putting this on today. I'm an analytics engineer here. And let's go ahead and get started. So for this first slide, since we're going to be going over tag management systems, I kind of wanted to cover the jargon of what we call things in tag management, because obviously, a tag is a tag, whether you're using just the popular ones off the top of my head, Google Tag Manager, Bright Tag, /Signal, or Insighten. We always call them tags. These are always, everybody gets that, but what some people might call a variable or a macro might be something different. What some people might call a trigger is something different. So I wanted to kind of cover all the concepts. These are the words I'll be using to describe these things throughout the talk, but I wanted to make sure everyone kind of at least had a high level idea of what we're talking about here. So when I think of a variable or macro, it's essentially either a value that's dynamically read off of the page or a static value that would be set in the TMS. This is the data. So when we think about what we're doing with a TMS, ultimately you can see I have this what, how, and when tagged down. So essentially, just for an example, we'll just talk about a Facebook pixel. And if we have a Facebook pixel, there's certainly some kind of information that we want to collect about this page or this action or something that's happening, and the information is the what. This is, what are we moving? What do we care about? Is it a button click? Where that button was? Description about that button? Maybe a user ID? That is the what that we're moving, and that's what we collect in variables or macros or that kind of object creation. So if you're using a system that doesn't use macros or variables, you might just have an object in your page. But when I talk about a variable or macro, this is what I'm talking about, is the actual object that will get passed to said thing. And the how is the pixel transporting, or whether it's you're sending an HTTP request, or it's something that transfers this data over. So, and that's ultimately the tag's role. It takes that object that we've created, whether the TMS creates it or not, some do, some don't, and then transport it. But sometimes we don't want that to happen when the page loads. Sometimes we want it to happen when a button is clicked, or when a user scrolled up or showed some kind of interaction with the site. So when I'm talking about a trigger, that's essentially what I'm getting at, is the when. A lot of my examples I'll use in this are geared towards GTM. If I don't explain how the custom code for this would work and you want to know, please post it in the questions. I'll go over it. I've worked with multiple TMSs, and while this one's geared towards Google Tag Manager, and I have some code to use if you're not using GTM for some of these slides, if you want to know how to get something done, please post a question, and I'll get to you whenever I can. There's also if you post the questions, there's a little hand raise a mode that you can do. If I see that at any time, I'll look to see if you have a question. But now we're clear with that, let's go ahead and dive in. So first thing on the agenda today is going to be establishing a complex data layer. A lot of us are probably familiar with the idea of what a data layer is. Some might not be. We'll get to that. I'll start high level, and we're going to kind of drill down from there. So don't be nervous if you don't exactly know what the data layer is. We'll go over its purpose and what we use it for. But essentially, we want to talk about how structuring a data layer the correct way can make your job a lot easier. It can cut development time. It can make sure that we find errors faster. And there's a lot of just having a data layer for certain uses isn't necessarily the greatest thing. It's a good step, but having a nice, complex, documented out data layer can save an immense amount of time, and this is going to be the first thing that we're going to tackle today. So first thing is, what is a data layer? So for those of you that have no idea what a data layer is, this is a great infographic. So you can see on the bottom, there's all of these services. You can see Twitter down there and a number of other services. But essentially, you have interaction on a page. And like we talked about up top, here's this page, something's going to happen. There's a behavior, and you want to send this to whether it's a marketing tag or any vendor at all. Just that ultimately with TMSs, ultimately we're trying to get information to a vendor with our what, when, and how, just like I said. And then the data layer is represented by this 1 and 0 binary layer right here that the website is plugging into, and then that data layer then plugs into all of our networks and vendors and everything that we need. That's the high level kind of description of what it is. How we actually implement it is a little bit differently. So the way that it's implemented is it's typically an array on a page. Now, for those of you that don't know JavaScript, don't freak out too much. I'll kind of explain what this is. For those of you who wanted to see what the data layer look like, how it works, this is kind of what this is meant to describe. So essentially an array, you can see where it says object, 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 object. That is an array. And in that language, what an array would be is a collection of things. And you interact with the array by putting more things into that collection. So that would be what we call a data layer.push. And when we're pushing objects into this thing, what we want out of a data layer is to have a centralized thing in JavaScript that holds all the information for all of our vendors. I'm actually going to jump back one slide. We don't want this thing to have just one purpose. You can see it's hooking into all of these different vendors. So the purpose here is to push things into this array. These are objects. You can see here this event is a GA scroll event, and there's information about this event. Apparently, because it's called GA scroll, this is going to Google Analytics. This event is named essentially Google Analytics scroll, and it's the percentage that someone has scrolled on the page, and the category is the scroll depth, and the label is the baseline. They went to the baseline of the scroll depth, and we don't want it to be an interaction event, and it's got a value of 1. These are all just, that's the what, and the when would be the event. It's telling us this event is a GA scroll. When this scroll happens, we push it to the data layer, and then here's the what, and then it's up for the TMS to pick that up and do the how or where. So another note here is the way the data layer actually works is they have overridden the push method, and you can do this this is a little bit different. I'm going to explain it with Google Tag Manager first, and then we're going to jump over to how it would work with other TMSs that don't actually define the data layer for you. So with Google Tag Manager, you can see this event is here, and what they've done is overrode the push method. When you say overrode, so I told you if you have an array and you use .push on it, what that's going to do is it's going to push an object in. Well, we don't want just an object to push in. If we put in a certain object, we want it to do something. So what they've done is they've overrode the push method. So yes, it puts it in the array, but it's going to run some logic for us. And that logic is ultimately going to be if that event matches the name of an event in GTM. And if we've set up a trigger in GTM for that event, it'll go ahead and fire a tag for us with all of this information. The beauty of this, and this is where I was going at, that having a nice data layer that's organized and well documented, it's going to save you developer time. So say on a GA scroll event, you wanted to send a Google Analytics hit, like this most likely is doing. But say you also wanted to send a Facebook hit. You don't have to have separate pixels now. You can literally go into GTM, and when that event comes through, it's already going to be set up to send a GA event. You can also say, when the event equals this, also send a Facebook event, and here's the information all there for us. So that's the beauty of having the centralized data and the control there. If you're using a system that is not in GTM, you would have to override the push method yourself. So this next slide is going to kind of break down exactly how that's happening. So here I have a function do something, and for the sake of logic, we'll just imagine that comment that says do some things is logic that's being done. So that's something that this function was previously doing. Now you're going to say, I'm going to redefine the do something function to do something else. So this code down here, you can see where I've reassigned the old do something to be called original do something, and now there's a new something. And what this JavaScript here is doing is it's taking what was previously being done, keeping that same functionality, but doing a little more. This is where if you were working with your own custom data layer, you could override the push method just like GTM had done to say, when this new something function in my second declared function would say, if this object is coming in, we're gonna iterate through this object and we're gonna look at the events. If these events are any of these X values, then we need to do this to them. And you can kind of set up that same conditional logic. That way, you kind of separate all of the concerns as far as what the developer has to do and then when things happen in what order. You don't have to, it doesn't mix all the pots. You centralize when this thing happens, it pushes to an event, and then this function here that we're overriding will decide if we're going to fire this pixel or this pixel or this pixel, and those can all be tiered down and fired in a correct order with one centralized place. It's a little bit more complicated here. So the big thing that you want to do with the data layer is not only collect the correct data, but manage state change. So with every push to the data layer, what you want to say is, and in this case we've used event, but you can use your own terminology. If you're not in GTM, GTM automatically picks up event. But if you're using your own data layer with your own overrode push method, what you're going to want to do is separate the different things on the page. So in this case, we have a timing hit for scroll depth, and then we have one that's non-interaction. So you use GA scroll event instead of the GA timing event. You can see we've named these two events differently so we can treat them differently because they have different information and they're going to be firing different things. So ultimately, what you're wanting to do with the data layer, and we'll get to this later, I have a specific page where we're going to look at and determine how we differentiate what different type of hits and how we would walk through this process. But ultimately what I'm getting at with this slide is you want one thing that's managing your state change. You don't want on-click listeners for buttons, multiple on-click listeners for the same buttons, because that's scary. You don't want to, then it's hard to manage and you don't necessarily know what's coming out of that. But if you have this centralized object controlling when each event's happening and what data is getting sent, you have one place to look at. You won't mismanage everything going around. And the other thing the data layer is good for is priming conditional logic. So for this instance, I'm going to explain this like it's an e-commerce page. And here I've done a data layer push for just a simple object into this data layer. So you can see I defined this data layer as an array, and then I pushed an object into it. If I were loading this object on just any page, if we're using something like Signal or anything where you can only fire script tags, you don't have these listeners for events, I might want to look and fire a tag based off of what's in this data layer. So if we had a page that's both a website that has both blog functionality and e-commerce functionality, I could say, does data layer .ecommerce exist? Is that object there? If that object is there, I can fire my e-commerce code that then checks if the e-commerce object has impressions in it. Here it does. So since there's an impressions array, we'll iterate through this array, which it's empty in this case, but we could go through that array and send all of our impressions. But just by having the correct structure here, where if e-commerce is there, it exists. If it's not there, it doesn't exist. We can fire conditional logic to kind of process through. So it gives us a little bit more structure to how we create our tags, and then all of that information can be put in one place. So if our analytics tag needs to look at the e-commerce, and then our Facebook tag, and then our Twitter tag, and then Optimizely, they all can look into the same place for the same data. And they could all be fired by that same conditional logic based off of our object structure. So what are the benefits to having a centralized data layer? Greatest thing, all tags have access to the same data. There's no double work. If you say, on this button click, I want to know what user was signed in, I want to know where they came from, where there's certain query parameters, blah, 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 you come up with this whole list of all these things you want to know when said event happens. You don't have to keep reusing that code every time you go to send something for that event. So if you're sending it to X vendor, Y vendor, Z vendor, you don't have to re-put that code in. Instead, it all goes to the data layer, and then with a certain event name, and then based off of that event name, you can read out of each of those values and send them on their way. You're essentially only ever have to building one object. The other good thing about a data layer is you've established the benchmark of what to track. You know what you're going after now. You can continue broadening your documentation, and it's kind of what's getting tracked and where. Whether each vendor's using those pieces, you don't know, but adding each vendor on from there becomes very easy. We've kind of put, this is what we're tracking at least across all of our vendors. You can keep a documentation of how it grows, and it can go from there. So the other great thing about data layer interaction is tags can fire sequentially. So if you're just doing on a button, you're doing on clicks, it's basically the order that on click is gone, and you kind of lose track of that if that code's mismanaged. I realize that might be a little bit confusing to people that don't interact with code every day, but essentially if code is defined at different parts of the page to listen to a button, it's the order that they come in getting defined, which may not be by design. You may not have put them in that order when you were on there. You just added this script to this area because it was safe, and now it adds a listener, and then this thing executes. Basically, if we're listening and if we're defining to listen to this data layer push and fire things off of it, or if we're looking for this data layer structure and then firing things off of it, we can set the order in which we call the functions that consume that. So that gives us a way to kind of sequentially fire these. Also in GTM, which I'll get to later, it's in one of the later slides, you can do that all with a click of a button, which is one of the powers of GTM, that you don't necessarily need a developer to do any of this once you have the data layer. Another thing, which is kind of a good thing and a bad thing, is when incorrect information is put into a centralized data source, then you find it faster when it's incorrect. Say if you have a product ID that is blank, if you have product IDs blank in Twitter and analytics and in Facebook and in Optimizely, and all these things are going through, you're going to see one of the people that's looking at those things every day is going to find it very fast, and you can go right back to the problem. You have a lot of eyes on this. It also is unfortunate that when something does go wrong, it's across all things, but it also fixes your problems a lot faster. You don't miss these problems. They're all reading from the same place, which means when it's correct, everything is correct. There's no corner cases. And like I've said many times so far, having this robust data layer completely minimizes the developer workload, because they've already built all these things that we're collecting, so they're just taking simple little pixels and dragging out of them. It makes it a lot easier. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the data layer section of this. Now I want to get into building a user access management plan. So many times these bigger companies have so many different tag management properties, or whatever you want to call them, basically environments. There's multiple different ones on multiple different sites. How are you managing all these different users? How do you manage the access? How do you get to kind of a robust setup for this? So the first thing that I really want to touch on here is, do you need a user access system? If it's a smaller company, there's only 5 different, like even here, I have our company InfoTrust account, that these are the multiple containers we have under that account. And you see there's a couple test ones, there's some playground, there's some ones that we actually use, just different stuff that we've played around with here. With something like this, and if it's a reasonable amount of employees, nothing too crazy, manual work is probably the best option. You're only going to have to remove somebody if they've left or been let go, or maybe you're only adding people with view level access, and it's not too big of a problem. However, if you find yourself at a company where there's 2,000 of these properties, or even just a number beyond the point that manual labor would be ridiculous, then there arises a need to come up with a user access management plan. You got to come up with a way to deal with adding and removing all these losers. People are constantly getting let go or being hired on, and what departments have the right permissions. And that's kind of what this next slide is getting at, is identify the different roles that each person can have. So you can see here, since most of us are working with these same containers every day, we all do this constantly. Every one of us has publish rights. And essentially, if you're not familiar with GTM, it's the same as saving a tag or making a tag go live. GTM has this functionality where you can make a change, but it's not live until you click publish. So you can actually preview the changes before they go across to the site. I know a couple of the other TMSs don't have this. Essentially, you save the tag and it's updated and live. So the way you deal with that in other TMSs is just basically 2 different properties, and you copy the tags over. Essentially, though, whichever accesses your TMS has, you need to cover the different types of accesses and whether someone should have it. Maybe in this case, I would like maybe a marketer or an analyst or someone to have basically edit privileges, but not publish privileges. They can't actually save the tag. They can just change it and leave it there unsaved. That way they can have a developer review the code before they push it live, make sure there's no errors. Maybe people just need view access. Maybe you have a vendor that wants to know how you set things up and they just have view access. That could be the same, but it's important before we dive into how we're actually going to automate this and solve this problem to set up a set of rules of what types of users should have what types of access. This is a different kind of problem to solve, and you have to know what your company wants before you kind of start down these paths. So pretty simple, but just make sure you have a clear plan before you start stepping through these things, because it might matter in how we actually get to the end results, which is utilizing the management API. So essentially, most TMSs you work with are going to have an API for this sort of things. Actually, editing tags and stuff is a little bit different. Again, this not that that other TMSs wouldn't have this. This is just a GTM screenshot, but this is the API where you would pass in permission to GTM. Essentially, you would need a developer for this. You're going to need someone that can authenticate into Google services and then build out in whatever language they choose. This particular API basically can take almost any language hooking into it, and then you build in the language of your choice to where you can create users, delete users, get users, list users, and update users. So for each of these things, it's going to take a developer. And for this one, I kind of want to explain to segue into the next slide how we went through this as a company. So originally, we didn't really have this as an issue. We were like what I was talking earlier, manual wasn't really a big problem. When we were doing this, it was for companies that wanted to add 2 or 3. It wasn't necessarily companies that were engaged in putting on a lot of users or taking out, so it was an easy to do manually. Whether we helped them or taught them how to do it manually, it was sort of an easy thing. But we started getting some of these bigger companies that lots of users are going away or coming back. So one of the other developers in-house and I kind of owned this, and we started building out these services. And essentially, we would build them out so they would take in a list of emails and either add or remove users or change them all to this permission or whatever. But it became a thing where we were doing this more, and we were doing this more. And then no longer was it really a development task, but only developers knew how to use it. It was something that kind of just needed an interface. And when you're getting to this, you really want there to be a solution there. You don't want to waste developer time where they're just running the same script all the time. There needs to be some kind of solution from there. And this is where I'll kind of segue into the next slide, which is a solution for us, maybe not for everybody. Essentially, you can extend the reach of the API with an automation tool. I'll talk about this tool a little bit, but you don't necessarily have to use this tool. While this tool is great, it may not be for you. Come up with a way to automate it. If you start getting scripts where you're doing these same kind of API actions with your TMS, you want to come up with some way that you can put an interface on it, and a non-developer can use this thing every day. What we're looking at here is KNIME, and this is something that we've developed along with one of our other clients. And essentially, what this is doing here is in Google, it's authenticating into Google Analytics, which is that first node, and then it gets all of our profiles in Google Analytics. It runs some filters based off of profiles we don't want in there, and then it runs through a loop and gets all of the filters applied to all of those analytics accounts. And someone with no development experience at all could run this immediately. It's in plain English. You hook in, they have to have the same. It may take a half-hour KNIME training or something to kind of learn how to use these nodes. But once you get the idea, the same colors hook into the same things, you can kind of from there start creating these flows that'll ultimately just drop off a CSV for you, and then it's done. So in this case, this isn't the flow that I was specifically talking about with user access. But if it was, this final loop would just contain a massive CSV of all the users added, removed, updated, and it has logic, so you can do all of those steps at the same time, and you can kind of, it turns into a really good automation tool. And I would suggest for anybody that's interacting with TMSs on just a massive scale, look into the API and look into automation tools like this, because it could make some things that you think are mundane jobs, literally you click, run the flow, and walk away. And it's taking you 10 minutes a day, and it went from being 5 hours a day to 10 minutes. So great automation tool. I'll stop talking about it now, but look into those types of things if you are working with the APIs. So we move into tag organization and the idea of version control, which is starting to get introduced into TMSs. It just recently came into Google Tag Manager. Also naming conventions. How do you organize these things? Because a lot of times, for use of a better term, there's a lot of hands in the honeypot or in the cookie jar. Lots of people touching lots of things at the same time, and you don't want to overwrite someone else's changes. You don't want to push something live that shouldn't be live. There's lots of different things going on. How do you manage a bunch of people working in the same space at the same time? And that's really what we're going to go for with these next couple slides. So those of you that are not developers might have heard of GitHub, might not have heard of GitHub, but it's essentially a good example of version control. It has nothing to do with TMSs, but I'm going to give an overview of kind of what it does, because this is what's being introduced into TMSs. Essentially what it does is you have a file, and then that file can be branched into multiple different branches. So you have the same file and what's 3 different branches. And I can make a code change where I add a sentence to the bottom, and then the person B can add a sentence to the top, and then person C can add a sentence to the middle, and we can merge all those together. And as long as there's not an issue with merging those together, we now all made changes to the same file without overwriting each other's changes. This is a repository website that people use and service that people use in coding, and it's essentially just a way to make sure we don't overwrite each other and kind of control when things are getting put in and when not. So I'll talk about how this applies to TMSs. Essentially, you're going to have to learn how the version control of your TMSs work. I have not worked with this with Signal or with Insighten, but I have worked with this in GTM, and you can kind of see here each version has a version ID. Then they have the environment that it was in. We'll get to how we do environment control later. And then you see the actions on the far right. So basically the way those actions work, and the beauty of this version control is you can see the last push here was the 274 to the environments live and the environment latest. So both updates have been, both of the environments have been updated. They're totally up. Let's imagine someone wrote an infinite loop in there and it's just crashing everyone's pages and we need to roll back. All we have to do is go down to line 273, go to the actions, and publish that container again. That container with the changes that was recently breaking things still exists. Version 274 still exists, but it's not live anymore. It's not what GTM is serving up. And the reason I want to harp on that is it gives us the ability to push live and immediately roll back, and we have no dangers. We can then go change 274 and we'll have no problems. So this is something very common in TMS. Almost all will have this. So just make sure you're aware of the fact that you can roll back changes and that you can control these things. So the other thing is managing workspaces. This is an example I just spun up for this webinar where you can see I called it Tyler's environment, and the description is webinar example for Tyler. But how many times have you been creating a tag or had basically there's been people implementing tags for a couple months. You're about to do a release. They're not all in there. They're not in the live environment. Then it comes time to publish the container and you have to get a marketing pixel in today by Friday. The container's not getting published till next Friday, and then you have basically today or tomorrow to get this in. You're in a hurry. You don't want to undo all these changes. Now you can essentially spin up your own workspace that's based off of the previous version. So if we go back, if the changes are in preview mode right now, they're in what will be 275. But you can also make a workspace that branches off of 274 that's your version of what would be 275, and their changes aren't touching your changes. And as long as there's not conflicts between the two of them, you can both add them in when you're ready to add them in and not worry about overriding each other's changes or having to go through and make a lot of manual changes. So using workspace allows you to get things done in your own environment without overriding other people's changes. You can, where it says manage workspaces, if you're using GTM, you can switch back and forth between them, and then there'll be a button in there to also make new workspaces if you need. This is just a slide to show what it looks like on the screen where there are multiple workplaces. Here's where I have Tyler's environment. I'm in Tyler's environment. If I wanted to go back, I could go back to default workspaces. You can jump back and forth and make the changes where they're supposed to be, but that kind of lets you segment where work's being done and teams aren't constantly conflicting with each other. This is not from GTM. This is a picture off of somebody's Mac, or it might be a Linux terminal. But essentially, this is what it looks like if you have a merge conflict. Let's say on the right side, you can see they added this green code in, and then there's green code on the left side. which is similar, but it's in a different location. And then you see this purple code that is different with each one. And essentially, whenever you have conflicting changes in two different workplaces, you're going to have to solve these. And it's essentially going to say, do you want to delete this code? Do you want to add this code in here? Which parts of this did you intend to come in? Which parts were supposed to be ripped out? Did you pull this out on purpose? And you essentially take these two files, take all the changes you want and all the changes you didn't want, marry them together, and then say, okay, this is the file we wanted now, and you can move it in. This, and again, this, you very rarely have to do this, but if two people were working on the same tag and had multiple different changes, this is the kind of screen that would be brought to. I just want this in there so that everybody knows when you get to a screen like this, it's on purpose and it's not a big deal. Just make sure both people that made changes come in and know that their changes have gotten in. Moving on, name your commits or publishes when you change things. If your TMS supports it, which is something just recently added to GTM, please name them. I'm actually going to jump back a few slides so you can see what this looks like when it actually happens. You can see the name in the columns here for 270 through 273. Testing client ID fields to be set. If we saw today that there's an issue with that testing client ID fields to be set, we can roll back to that updating Git blog post date variable and just know when did that break. Maybe you made 3 quick publishes, 3 different developers were working, and you're like, when did that break? What broke it? Okay, we need to go back to before that. If you've named it, you don't have to go in and look at what the changes were. It was a descriptive name for what it was. You can go back. It makes organizing this whole thing a lot easier when a lot of people are working in it. So here's where you would pick the name of what you're pushing. You would put a description in so someone can click in. It's not just, publish that added Facebook pixel. You can say it added a Facebook pixel for add to cart and for purchase and for, et cetera, et cetera. Just give a more detailed description in the description. And then on the bottom here, you should, if you're using a kind of publishing environment, see the changes that are coming in with it. Another big thing, and this is something that's definitely universal across all TMSs, is what you're naming your tags. So often you have different vendors that have access to your TMS, or you have developers that are working on different vendors' tags. Use some kind of preface to those tags. These are all Google Analytics tags, so they have a GA dash. If I just put detail impression or impression tag or any of these names here, someone's not going to come in and inherently know what these are. And while you think I was the one in here making these changes, I know what this is, you always want to make something when you're dealing with environments with, again, lots of people with hands in the cookie jar, that they know exactly what the purpose of this thing is. It helps you keep organized, it helps them keep organized, and everyone can kind of have a good idea of how all of these things are coming together. They know I'm not trying to change Google Analytics. I thought impression tag was just for all impression tags, but I need to make my own Facebook impression tag or something like that. But having those prefaces will definitely let people organize. Again, it's a very simple thing, but little things like this make working in large teams much, much easier. The other big thing is folders, and if your TMS supports it, please, please, please use folders, because like I had all those Google Analytics ones, this is actually Simo Ohava's blog, if any of you are familiar. This is an image from his blog where he tells you if you have Universal Analytics e-commerce things, put them all into a folder. All these e-commerce things are in here. If you need to work on e-commerce, you can look in this folder, and you don't have to look at all these other tags or get confused. If you put something in here, so if someone only works on those things, they can only work in the folders, and it doesn't have that big scary look when you see 200 tags when you come into something. Everything's organized into folders. You know where you're supposed to be working. It severely limits your time. I mean, you'll save all kinds of time not looking for, getting confused, control Fing every 10 minutes. That wraps up the tag organization section. So I would like to transition into how we're going to identify and build a tag firing system. Some of these ideas that we're going to go over, I kind of touched into the data layer area, but now I'm going to talk about actually applying them to a site. And hopefully that'll make some of these ideas as far as events and things become a little bit more clear. So let's step into here. Since this is brought to you by Tag Inspector, I decided to use Tag Inspector's site, and I wanted to talk about how we would approach this kind of site. Before I even go to the next slide that kind of talks about what kind of questions we want to ask about this site, I want to talk about how I would approach this just by looking at it. What are things that we want to care about as far as firing a tag, or what are we interested in? What data are we trying to collect here? I have, and this is coming from me as a developer, so I have no idea what the marketing people are going to be interested in, what the sales people are interested in, how we're collecting revenue, what we're doing with analytics. I have no idea. I can just tell by looking at this, we're probably going to care how many people hit that button on the bottom left, start your free scan now. We're probably going to care how many people hit try it for free. And we're probably going to care about all of the people that clicked all of these buttons on the top. But the reason I put all of those buttons into one thing is one piece of code should control that. One piece of code could probably send us data layer pushes with all the information. So each data layer push, if they clicked on plans and pricing, it would send a data layer push, top bar clicked, but with the value, plans, and pricing. And that's where we're limiting what a developer has to do. All they got to do is push to that data layer with that information on those things. They don't have to worry about tying them for X tag, Y tag, Z tag. No, don't worry about that at all. Just do a data layer push for these three things and the information about them. Let me know that that right button was clicked or that bottom click, and just send an event that tells me it's specific to these red boxes. Each of these red boxes should have their own event name, and they should have their own information about what they are, and then we'll pick it up from there from the data layer. So moving on and kind of talking about, how I came to those conclusions. When you look at a page, you want to see what are the points of interest. So what button should fire a unique set of tags? Maybe, and I'll actually jump back. What I'm going for with that question is maybe from a marketing standpoint, this top right little green button and this bottom right button go to the same place, do the same thing. We don't want to differentiate them. We're going to leave both those buttons there forever. This isn't an A/B test on what they're clicking. So just fire the same event. I don't want to muddle my events by picking a difference of them because I don't care. Maybe you do care. But one of the first things you have to determine is, what are the unique parts? What's unique? Like a failure of uniqueness to me would be writing code for each of these things on the top. I would like to have a nav bar event for all of them, but then have the description of what happened on that nav bar click, because you're probably, unless one of them is specific and important to you for a reason, but ultimately those are the decisions you're trying to get. And kind of similar to what I was saying, what behavioral benchmarks are unique. It's not just clicks that we're interested in sometimes, like you saw the one where I was doing scroll tracking. And just kind of a plug here, one thing that we noticed as a company with impressions, people were constantly just loading impressions for products on page load, and that seemed incorrect to us. You don't want to, on the page load, if you load 200 product impressions, those 200 products weren't seen. The page was just loaded. So something that we did to identify a behavioral benchmark is when a user scrolls and sees a product, that's when the impression should go. So we developed a tag internally that when you're scrolling through a page with a lot of products, it will only send the impressions that are seen. And we went as far as judging how fast a user was scrolling. Did they go past the products? Don't send them. If they were scrolling really fast, they didn't see those. They were trying to get to the bottom. So only based off speed and how long it took after their first scroll, we really ironed it out so that from a UX experience, you were only getting the impressions that people saw. But these are the kind of things you want to define when you look at a page. What problems do I have? What things do I want to know about? What behavior am I interested in? What information is coming around it? And again, along with that, what state changes are we interested in? We're going to control these with events to the data layer, and we like I talked before, we can use overriding in the data layer to control all other things from there. But let's identify it. Let's look at a page and see what state changes we identified, and this is how you get to that robust data layer. Also, what data you need for each of these. When you look at these things, is there something specific about it you want to collect? How do you separate this action from another action? Kind of like what I was saying on this image. How do I separate that top right button from the bottom left button? Maybe I call it try for free button. Maybe I don't call it that. Maybe I don't want to separate them. Maybe I think they're the same button. But if you need to, come up with a naming convention, document it. Use a spreadsheet or something to document out all these things, because this is how we're going to get to building that data layer. This is coming up with our tag firing system and really knowing what we want to collect. So you want to identify all pieces of information, not just what one tag would use, but what all tags could possibly use about each of these. Having robust and clean data is great. And then again, where should I be storing this data? Definitely, we should be storing it in the data layer. So then you go on to communicating with the data layer. So each of those point of interest, like I said, I wanted that top nav bar to use one piece of code that should be pulling all of this. Code should be written for each of those points of interest to do a data layer push with the correct objects being pushed in, just sending that right data. And that's really just defining the data layer if you're not using a service that already does, and then pushing that code into the data layer is the heftiest part of the work. And then you should take this nightmare that is managing all these tags and make it very organized, clean, and clear what's happening. the second point that I have here under communicating with the data layer is essentially just saying make sure that the objects hold the state change. They tell us about what's coming in and the information that's coming in. And if your TMS supports it, leverage the tools that communicate with the data layer for you because it's a lot easier. I'll get to some of those in the next section, but essentially we just want to make sure that we're taking full advantage of what the TMS is doing for us. Yes, okay. So moving on. So this is an example that I showed earlier, but this is just to go back to really breaking down to how this data layer is going to communicate with the TMS, whether you overrode the function and you had your developers do it that way or you're using GTM. These things are doing, now we can talk about what we've talked about. The events are separated into GA timing and GA scroll. We have all of the information there. They hold their unique information about each situation where that happened, and now different tags can fire each of those things happening. Okay, so this last little point that we're going to go through is gaining control of the tag firing time. And this is a problem for so many people is, okay, I have these tags, but I need to fire then, or I need to fire then. And we touched on this a little bit, but there's some corner cases and some custom code that I want to go over. So essentially, imagine, just for argument's sake, or just to get into the mindset, we need to fire a Facebook pixel on the click of this button. And we just need that to happen. We're not going to think too much about the code. We just know that it needs to happen. But they're coming back to you. Well, Facebook isn't defined before then. It happens later on in the page, and the Facebook object isn't there. You're running into all these errors, and you want to find a way that you can kind of control this. So then you got to think, how many ways can a tag be fired if we're using a TMS? Well, it could be a pixel that's just already hard-coded on the page, just like your TMS is. How did it get on the page? It's either a script tag or a pixel or something that's already hard-coded on there. You might have a script tag already on the page as well. Then there's event pushes that trigger pixels or script tags to come into it or via the TMS, or there's page load tags in the TMS that also trigger those same types of tags to come in. So we're limited to when we can do things. I mean, if it's not in the event, it's not in the page load, none of these times are working out. How do we get around this problem? It's not defined right now, and I need to make sure that this thing is defined. I don't want to throw errors and break all the JavaScript, and everyone's yelling at each other, your tag broke my thing. What do we do to kind of delay things? Make sure this is here. Try to solve that problem. And essentially, when it comes to timing, there's really just sort of one solution here, and it's this code. And I'll try to turn this into English the best that I can. Essentially, what this code is doing, if we walk through, at the very bottom of the screen, it's calling this function. I just put that in there so it's clear that this function has to get called first with some value. And the value is how many times up to 5 do you want this code to run again? And essentially what it does is we're going to check and see if the Facebook object is undefined. So that first if statement, if the Facebook object is not equal to undefined, then we want to fire the Facebook functions and do what we want and then return. We're done executing things. We're returning out of here. Else, if we've gone through this thing 5 times, if we've ran this code 5 different times and we still haven't gotten the Facebook thing defined, let's return again. We've gone through this and we've tried. And then this last part is the interesting part, in that we're adding 1 to our counter, which was passed in, and then we call what's called a set timeout. And then recall the function with the counter increased by 1. What that 1000 is that's in milliseconds, so that's going to be a 1 second delay, and we're going to wait. We're going to loop through this one time, and if Facebook's still undefined, we've waited 1 second. So we called it once, we've waited 1 second, we checked if it was defined, or if we've gone through this 5 times yet, which we haven't, then we're going to call it again and wait 1 more second. And then we're going to keep it, and essentially what this will do is it'll wait 5 seconds. If that's still not done, stop running it. The reason for this, and what it's called, when a function calls itself, this is called recursion in the programming world. And the reason we use recursion is we want this to keep calling itself. We don't want to have to trigger it. We want it to keep listening for this thing to happen, but we need it to eventually stop, or that's what's called an infinite loop, and we don't want code to just run forever. And that's why we need this counter in here. Plus, you don't really want something going past more than 5 seconds anyways. That's typically the longest I'll want to go. Some people might argue to go longer, but I'll let people figure that out on their own. Essentially, this is the method to delay something a certain amount of time, and you can certainly change the number that's in that set timeout until something is done. So if you're running into these weird timing issues where something doesn't exist, then you can throw this kind of situation at it. So the next big thing is leveraging tag sequencing. If you have a bunch of tags that need to fire in an order, you can either via function calls. So if you're using something like Signal that doesn't have this kind of fire this tag on this event, or these like the idea of triggers in Signal, they'd be page rules, and this tag just fires on this page, and then you write custom JavaScript to figure out when it fires. You would just call those functions in a certain order from a master function, but you would probably usually need a developer to mess around with reordering those functions and making sure things are defined correctly to trigger it all off in that order. And then you would ultimately call that function from your overridden data layer. In GTM, no custom code is needed at all. Essentially, we can just say, hey, we have this all classic GA URL parameter parser and cookie writing, but after that fires, I need to fire my page view because I just did something to the URLs, and then now I'm going to fire my page view. So I can literally just go to fire a tag after, and the cleanup tag, I can pick my GA page view, and this fires afterwards. And then say I want something to fire after a GA page view. I can then go to that one and select another tag to fire after, and you get this kind of cascading chain in which you can set the literal sequence of tags and make sure everything's firing in a specific order based off of what's most important, what needs to fire first, what relies on something to fire before it. But it's very nice to have this all neatly in the UI. Okay, so another thing is how to limit the firing of something. So say we do have a Google Analytics page view, but Google Analytics needs to be defined first, which GTM should be. But in any type of language, if there's something that needs to be defined first, anything you need to fire something, but something needs to fire first. With GTM, what you can do is you can just say fire this thing before, but only do it once per page, so that if these multiple events happen, you're not following this page views. You're not calling these page views multiple times. You're not calling these things over and over again. You only want to fire it once. You can just do this once per page, but make sure it has been fired before this thing that relies on it. If you wanted to do this with custom code, you would do it like above, where you can see I defined an object called Facebook vars. It just stands for Facebook variables. It's a known custom thing that I came up with, and then it's nothing specific to like a Facebook standard or anything. And then in that object, you make a fired variable, name it false. Then you check when you're going to send Facebook information. I just made up a fake function that would send that information. If it's false, go ahead and send it, and then we'll set it to true. And then for the rest of the time, if that's ever called, it won't get sent through. This is just a checker. The reason for that Facebook underscore vars object, and this is something that a lot of developers would just instantly get, but people might not be familiar with why I took that extra step. Global variables are scary. If someone else made something called Facebook vars, they could just overwrite my value. But odds are someone else wouldn't make an object named Facebook vars and then make a dot fired value in it. I'm just nesting it down as like an indirection to make sure people aren't overwriting what I have set up, is why we took those steps there. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up what I was covering today. Were there any questions that anybody had? If you have any questions, you can type them at the bottom here. If not, we can go ahead and end this. I'll give you guys a few minutes. Okay, well, it's not looking like we got any questions coming in, so I'll go ahead and end the broadcast. Thank you all so much for coming. If you come up with any questions, feel free to send them over. Oh, we got one coming in. Here we go. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to get this to pop out. Darren, could you post that question again? It stopped halfway through the question. I only got when applying conversation or conversion tracking script to AdWords. Here we go. There we go. I got the rest of it. Okay. So Darren says, when applying conversion tracking script for AdWords, do you recommend setting the tag firing once per page on the thank you page? Yes. So depending on what your setup is with AdWords and whether you're sending to multiple accounts or not, I've actually seen clients where they don't set it up into one AdWords container where that kind of sends out to all of the different places they needed to go, and they actually need individual ones. You would define essentially the script once at the top of the page that you need to send the conversion, and then you would send all of the conversion hits. If you're using Google Tag Manager, I would very much recommend using the templated tags. Google or AdWords is great for that, and for each of the different conversion IDs, essentially you just fill in the information, and if there's revenue metrics, you can fill those all in. If you're not, obviously you have, I imagine your AdWords rep has sent you over a basic script tag that is going to contain the information that you're sending, but again, I would set a rule so that it only fires once. Another thing that I didn't actually cover, and this is kind of related to this, and this might be what you were going for with this question, how do you deal with multiple transactions on a tag and on a page where you have a transaction ID and you have a transaction hit? You don't necessarily, but the transaction page can be refreshed. You don't want to send it. You can essentially create a rule that reads out of a cookie, and when the transaction page gets hit, you check to see if this cookie has ever existed. I'll just kind of walk you through this logic right here. If this cookie has ever existed, then we read out of the value. If the cookie doesn't exist, then we need to create this cookie and set its value to be the current order ID. And I'll kind of go back to where I started, but I just want to walk through how this logic is going to work. So you cookie the order ID. If the cookie already exists, then it has an order ID, and you're going to then read out that cookie value, put a delimiter in there, and another order ID. And what this allows us to do is we're cooking all the order IDs that have ever happened on this page. The user can still refresh over and over again. And also, before you rewrite the order ID in, you make sure it's not currently in the string that's in the cookie. But if you write code to do this so that you're essentially the logic that I just walked through is just saying, have they ever visited this transaction page before? And you're using that cookie to manage it. Now, obviously, this is subject to them clearing cookies, which is just, in that case, there's just no way to get around this problem. But if they are using the cookie, then we can check to see if they've ever been there, and you can set a rule like conditional logic, like I said, to not fire a tag. If if the order ID is in this cookie, set this variable to false. If that variable is false, do not fire that tag again. And then we've essentially made it so that if you are refreshing on transaction pages, then you're not sending those hits over and over again, which can be a problem for a conversion with both Google Analytics and AdWords. They typically do dupe if they're within the same session, but if for some reason you have a page where they can just always go back to the transaction page and they treat it like a thank you page that can be revisited, then you open up a new session and get a new hit even though it's the same order ID. So you'll get some weird metrics, especially in Google Analytics, where you're seeing more transactions than you actually do order IDs, which doesn't make sense. And it's because order ID is a standard thing, but same with AdWords, you would see weird conversions coming through where you're getting multiple conversions from the same transaction ID. But essentially the cookie approach is how you would get that. And again, I would also limit that to happening once per page. Hopefully I covered that question well enough. I'll give us another 30, 40 seconds, and if there's no more questions. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yep, sometimes you get two conversions applied to a single visitor. That's okay if they had multiple transactions. I mean, correct, you would want to track that twice. But if that's what you're going for, essentially what I would I don't know if you're a developer or not, if you have a team of developers. If you're not a developer, you can look at Stack Overflow, and they'll actually have some pretty straightforward little snippets for you to play with. If you can play around in your TMS of setting a cookie and reading a cookie, they'll have functions for that. Once you understand how to use those functions, walking through that logic would be really simple. You also need to do some string manipulation to check to see the value of what's in. And if you want to send an email over to GA support after this, we can get back to you with some example code and kind of walk through how that would actually look. But essentially what you're going to want to do is set those values in those cookies and then read those values. Make sure if the value is already in the cookie, don't add it again. And if it's already in the cookie, don't fire any other pixels. If it's not already in the cookie, this is the first time we're seeing it, write it to the cookie and send your event in the simplest terms. But okay, other than that, again, I'll give 30 more seconds for another question, and if not, we can go ahead and end this, guys. All right, well, that's looking like it's going to be it. Again, I want to thank you all for coming out. If you have any questions, again, feel free to reach out to us, and I hope to see you all in the next webinar. Thank you very much.